have you just done
quite a
like
few, I think.
interviews?
Yeah, we've done. I think our first one was we did like a react stream for like Sam Cedar's Jubilee, and we did a react to a Shoe on Head video about U.S. aid. I think that's it, right? Was there
I think
something
that
else?
was it. Yeah. No, I think that was just those two.
Yeah, like they go pretty well. I think I don't know about today because I wanted to make sure we locked in the time before I announced it, so I don't know how many viewers we'll get this time, but we usually get like 50 people in the chat.
Yeah, it's usually a good number.
Okay.
So yeah, I'll do a quick little intro. Hello everyone, welcome to the stream. I'm Jacob,
I'm Bob.
and today we're joined by Econoboi. So we're gonna be having a nice little chat here, and I'm gonna hand it over to Bob because in terms of economics, I'm kind of a dumbass, and these two know what they're talking about, so I'm gonna be mostly staying quiet this time.
There's levels to the game. I think I'm still pretty distantly behind our dear guest today, but we're here to solve economics, specifically left-wing economics today. That's the goal of this stream. So I wanted to hand it over to Econoboi to introduce yourself to the people, tell them who you are, what you do, and what do you believe in, Econoboi?
Yeah, hey everyone. Thanks for having me, and hope you guys enjoy. Hope it's a little educational, a little entertaining. But I'm Econoboi. I do, I guess I got into the online politics streaming game about probably 4 years ago at this point. And I started out doing a lot of scripted videos about economics, just like little explainer videos on, this is what this means, and this is an explainer for this issue, like immigration, taxes, all this kind of stuff. And that was after I finished grad school in finance and economics. I just had a lot of free time, and so I figured, why the heck not? Let's do this. And I started debating a lot of people as well, like doing a lot of debates and going on shows and stuff like that. Kind of just built an audience, pretty slowly over time. And I got a little bit, uninterested, I guess, in doing edited content and, video content like this. So I started a Substack, and, I think we have like 750 readers on Substack at this point, which is pretty cool. I didn't really think my goal now is like, oh, can we get 1,000 before the end of the year? But it's pretty cool to write articles and people read them. It feels like, I don't know why, but writing an article feels like fancier than making a video. It's like, oh, look at me, I wrote an article.
100%.
But there's something about it, I guess. But what do I believe as well? So I started out, I've always been very progressive left in terms of my inclination. So I would say like the most conservative I've ever been in my adult life was basically Bernie Sanders level progressive Democrat. I'm 28 now, and I've drifted, I would say, slightly further to the left. I'd call myself a socialist now. That was like I guess that was the article series that you guys saw, was like, oh, how I became a socialist, and I wrote that and recently finished that up. So if you'd want one, progressive capitalist's journey to being just a full-on socialist, I guess that's my latest series on my Substack, where I kind of go from, like, these are the arguments that kind of initially made sense to me, and then at the very, very end, I propose like a model, like what I think to be like a pretty workable model for social ownership at the very, very end. So,
yeah, I really enjoyed the articles, and I think I was watching those debates. I don't even know, like some of them were just kind of like polite discussions, which I think I appreciated because it was nice to not see people just like screaming at each other about this stuff and actually trying to figure out what the truth was. But like, I could see like the kernel of kind of the Matt Bruenig conversation you had, which I think we'll probably dig into in a little bit, like to get from there to here, even at the time as I was watching all this play out. I'm curious if you could start, like, kind of break down for us, like, what was that kind of journey in terms of you going around and debating those people or like having those conversations? Like, first of all, I'm wondering how you actually got all of these people to talk to you at the time.
Yeah, really. I really don't know. It was a I guess just a quick process, and we had some good timing as well. I made a bunch of videos initially about economics, and eventually Socialism Done Left, he reached out and said he wanted to talk to me because I think this was when I had like 500 subscribers or something, so I was still very, very small, and one of his audience members reached out to him and said, you should talk to this guy. He seems like a pretty, knowledgeable person. And so I spoke to him, and then I think I had built at that point just enough of an audience to where I could, I think I tweeted at Vosh, and I said, like, we should talk about economics or debate socialism or something like that. And when I debated Vosh, that it turned out just to be a pretty good look for me. I don't want to say like, oh, I destroyed him in that debate or anything, but it seemed like the general takeaway was that I did pretty well in that conversation. And that got the attention of Destiny. And so then I spoke to Destiny, and a whole bunch of DGGers subscribed to me. And I think at that point, the ball was just rolling. And so I was able to kind of hit the debate circuit pretty aggressively. And people, at least within the online like politics space, had kind of heard of me. And so I was able to get a lot of those conversations done. I had a second conversation with Vosh, was able to speak with a lot of different economists. Or not economists, but like economic thinkers and like different socialists and progressives and stuff. And some of the people, to be fair, it seemed easy enough just to message them on Twitter. Like my conversation with Alex Narasta, who's like the head of study. Basically, his title is kind of interesting. His title, I think, is like the head of economic and policy studies at the Cato Institute. I literally just Twitter DM'd him, and he just got back and said, "Yeah, I'll talk to you." And I was like, "Oh, that's pretty sweet." And so did the same thing with Matt Bruenig, and he got back to me. And so some people really, it turns, unlike the conversation that we had right before you started stream, some people really do just answer, their messages and emails. And so I was able to secure some conversations that way as well.
So I remember watching your conversation with Vosh at the time, and Jacob hates Vosh like with a passion. And I mean, I wouldn't say I'm a fan. I don't think many people publicly like call themselves Vosh people anymore. I think he kind of stopped doing debates in general after some of this horse stuff came out. I feel like it just got a lot harder for him to like have serious conversations. So I don't hear about him at all anymore. It looks like he's still out there getting a lot of views and stuff, but I guess he just kind of has his community. Yeah. But I remember at the time like watching your conversation, and I mean, you tell me like how you remember it, but I remember it mostly just being like you kind of raising pretty reasonable objections to, oh, well, if we turn everything into a worker cooperative, how would that work? Like, how do you give up ownership? How are you going to get around the incentive of people to not hire more workers if, they're giving up equity? And I just seem to recall him kind of just being like, I don't know, but we'll figure it out. Like that. And this was a guy who, at the time I understood him to be someone who had like had a ton of debates about this exact thing. And I was like, what do you mean you don't know? Like what? That seemed, he just kind of was like, oh, well, it's like a moral stance that I'm taking. Maybe it won't work, but we'll figure it out later. And you were kind of like, I don't know, you seemed like you were kind of trying to dig in and get him to really think about things. He just didn't seem interested. Like, am I wrong? Or is that like more or less how that conversation went down?
Yeah, I mean, I think Vosh is a really effective like speaker and like rhetorician. Certainly he's a really good public speaker. I mean, that's how he's become such a big, he's still got a really sizable YouTube channel. He basically does, like you said, like more, he essentially does like news commentary now, and doesn't really seem to do a lot of debates or discussions. Just kind of on occasion he does them, my understanding. But yeah, I mean, I think that the problem there, and this was like kind of one of the problems that I had with my initial aversion to socialism, was that, and I talk about this in the first part of the How I Became a Socialist article, was that a lot of my initial exposure to socialists, like actually existing socialists, wasn't necessarily the historical socialist thinkers. It was people who I knew in real life, like political organizing, who were socialists, and people who I spoke to in my capacity as a Econoboi online who were socialists. And yeah, that was kind of my experience, was that a lot of socialists, I think, had a really difficult time, I guess, like explaining their socialism in a way that was intuitive or seemed rational to me. Like me as a person who studied economics, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about like how exactly does your model work, and like how exactly would the economy run? Like what are the kind of the big overarching kind of themes of your ideal economy? And if your substantial answer to that is like, well, I mean, I just don't really think that'll be a problem, or, oh, well, insofar as that's a problem, like, I don't think that's a big deal, or you think it's a big deal, but I don't have a good reason. It's just, that's probably, a lot of times that was like your best case scenario. But then, unfortunately, a lot of the times as well, there are a lot of socialists that you speak to that they don't even go as far as Vosh. Like a lot of times they won't have like they won't even have like a positive conception at all, right? Like some people will, and some people will define socialism as like, socialism is when you have a rejection of capitalism, right? And it's like, that's just what it is. And it's like, well, that's just a little bit too vague for me. I get it, like anarchists and stuff like that. I address anarchists in the piece as well, that intellectually, I think a lot of people can like get on board with a lot of what anarchists say. Like, oh, unjust hierarchy is bad. The state can be oppressive. The state is inherently oppressive. These coercive rules of like property rights and state aggression are all really really bad. And it's like, okay, yeah, yeah. Like intellectually, it's like, sure, that's not the most like insensible thing to say, but it's like when an anarchist, it feels like when an average anarchist tries to like describe what their actual worldview would look like, it just doesn't. It just they can't describe it very well, in my opinion. Or they'll describe a scenario where it's like it sounds very, it sounds very like, oh, like you'll have, it's a totally new reimagined way of doing things, and the common ownership of property through all of these different collective trade institutions, and it's not markets but it's planning, and it's like we won't have money anymore. And it's like, dude, I don't, it's, I mean, maybe like all I can really say to that is like maybe. It just sounds like you're describing like a fictional like story almost more so than a chapter of human history.
Yeah.
So it's like maybe that's true, but I'm always really going to be insistent on the model and what people are really actually proposing to do with our institutions. And that's where kind of Matt Bruenig came in, and I think he provided what I think to be a pretty grounded model where you can agree or disagree with his model, but you can certainly imagine it. You can certainly imagine his model, and you can see in part his model working in practice. So that was pretty, I think that was a pretty big moment for me in my journey.
It's funny that you mentioned the like it seems more like a story, especially because that's just literally Star Trek. Like, like so often when people pitch these like, oh, I've got this like magical idea, it's just like, right, but you just wrote down what Gene Roddenberry did in the 1960s. That's not an economic model. That's just wishful thinking.
Well, if you want to tell us how you want to get there, like,
Yeah,
sure,
exactly.
I'm open. It sounds cool. I'm open to the idea, but it seems like every time an anarchist explains like their system, if you kind of drill down for long enough, eventually they just start describing like lynchings to like solve certain societal problems. And like, personally, that's not my style.
I don't know if you know Sam Cedar, but his debating libertarians.
Yeah,
where
exactly.
He just starts going on and like really trying to get them to talk about like how their version of the world works. And he has his favorite thing to do is just like, right, but I'm just going to show up with a bunch of guys.
Yeah.
What are you going to do about that?
Yeah, Matt Bruenig, he has libertarians. I'll just say this: that libertarians are, in terms of their theory, they are way worse than socialists and leftists, in my opinion. They are way worse than socialists and leftists. I've never been convinced by any libertarian, big and small, anarcho-capitalists to like small government, like Gary Johnson type libertarians. I dunked on a libertarian today because I on Substack on Substack, I can't even recall. I don't recall oh yeah, it was some libertarian showed up in my Substack feed and they were like, government is never the solution to problems, and I'm like, government is really oftentimes the solution to problems, and that's why I said. And a bunch of libertarians like responded to me, and I love, you get so many like funny libertarian arguments. I remember like one of my favorites. They always hit the same ones. One of my favorites got hit immediately during this thread. They say, look, I don't want the government involved in my life. I just want the government involved in enforcing property rights and the police and courts. And it's like, dude, what the fuck? Like, did you realize what you just said? Like, this is the small government libertarian, which is so funny to me. It's like, I'm a small government libertarian. I do think the government should be in charge of nuclear weapons, and they should have a monopoly on violence. They should get to decide when and how exactly to arrest you and imprison you. But other than that, I mean, the government shouldn't be involved in anything too important. It's like, dude, what the fuck? Like, I feel like my position of like, I just think the government should tax and spend money around in the economy, that just conceptually sounds a lot less radical than the government should be the sole arbiter of what to do with the nuclear weapons. That's just me, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems, it's weird to be like, I don't trust the government except for their right to kill me. That's the one thing I want to preserve. And I mean,
right.
I always think like the model that you or like Matt Bruenig or like, I presumably us like prescribe of, universal benefits wherever possible, things like that. It seems like a lot less, like in some ways, a lot less government, a lot less like me having to wait in lines or like send out something in the mail or like get a permit or like have to like go through all these hoops to like get money from the government. It seems like if they just give you the money, like, I don't know, it just always struck me as like, it's not like I want a nanny state in the sense that it's, you know, interfering with your personal life and decisions, but like I do want the government just give people a bunch of money all the time. That actually seems like a less intrusive process than otherwise.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So libertarians, I think, yeah, and I've written about this. What I don't know that they're totally original arguments. I try not to, you know, when it comes to the philosophy or economic stuff, I try not to write things that I think are just like regurgitating other thinkers. Obviously, everything's derivative to some degree, but you know, I've written a little bit about what I think to be, you know, somewhat unique arguments against libertarianism and like anarcho-capitalism and stuff like that. But it's just a very, to me, it is just a very incoherent ideology. Anarcho-capitalism, anarcho-communism, at the very least, like when it comes to anarcho, like leftist anarchists, or like even like leftists who I just have a lot of you know, like Vosh or Ben Burgess or people like that, right? It's like I feel like they're coming from a normatively sensible place, right? That like, hey, like I'm against domination, I'm against unjust hierarchy. I have like a robust critique of the workplace, right? Like, oh, you know, the power that a boss exerts over an employee is unacceptable. You know, that's how a lot of like worker democracy socialists are sprouted up. And it's like, you know, I have disagreements with those people, but it's it's a totally different realm of disagreement between those people and like libertarians. I think where normatively, I think libertarians are quite a bit more bankrupt um, than your average leftist. So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that kind of brings us to what I wanted to talk to you about in terms of the series you wrote. Like, you would obviously interact with a bunch of, I would say, certain leftist creators that were a little bit loopy, and then some that were, you know, reasonable in some ways, maybe not fleshed out. And I found there were some conversations you would have where they would kind of just, I don't know, like, I don't want to name names. We're going to name names anyway because, you know, we don't have that many people that are going to watch this anyway. But, like, I remember thinking, like, Unlearning Economics and Loner Box specifically, I was like, I had a pretty high regard for both of them at the time. Nowadays, maybe one more so than the other. But, like, I remember thinking, like, okay, these guys seem to have a pretty good handle on what they're talking about. But when you talked to them, it felt like they were kind of content to just be like, you know, socialism thing. Like, I like it, but, you know, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And I was like, guys, like, I thought we were going to push for this a little bit more. Like, I don't know. It seemed odd to me that some people were content to concede on the whole socialism thing when that was a big part of the brand, I thought.
Well, again, yeah, like people like Unlearning Economics. And again, I think that the truth is, I think practically speaking, I mean, even Ben Burgess, you know, I recently had a conversation with Ben Burgess, which I'm going to try and upload at some point. If he doesn't upload it first, I think oftentimes he reposts things, which is totally fine, just to be clear. But he might beat me to it, is all I meant to say. But even a guy like Ben Burgess, you know, we had like this back and forth. And I think it's probably one of the better back and forths I've ever had with like a worker democracy socialist, where, you know, he was like, look, I mean, at the end of the day, because I guess at that point also my frame was like, I just have a different socialist model than you do. I think at that point, like, he was just like, look, you know, at the end of the day, you know, if a governing coalition existed to enact your plan, I'd be quite excited about that. You know, like I'd be very excited about that, understanding that it's not exactly my ideal model, but your model is obviously far preferable to our currently existing, you know, more capitalist dominated model. And I think that's probably true as well with like worker democracy socialists, where I've certainly got some disagreements which I think are valid, but you know, I'm not, it's, these are certainly partners, these are certainly like coalition partners, I think, right?
Yeah.
And I think as well that a lot of worker democracy socialists, I think that they come to, you know, I think that they come to their socialism from like a very different place than I do, or that people who are more like social ownership oriented people come to, where I think that a lot of worker democracy socialists, they really do, they really kind of start with their critique of the workplace, right? Like people like Ben Burgess will say, you know, you go to this place 8 hours a day and it's not, you know, it's not democratic. You know, for 8 hours a day, you're under like the rule of an employer. And that is true, like full stop, that is true, right? Workplaces aren't liberal places. You don't have freedom of speech. You don't have free like rights basically in terms of interacting with your workplace. Where I think that I would just differ with them though is that I would say, well, look, worker board membership and unions are democratic structures in the workplace, and they just seem to work quite well. I was raised by a grandma who was part of a union, and it just seemed like the kind of like domination from bosses that they were describing was the type of domination that you see in places without unions, right?
Yeah.
But not necessarily places without worker ownership. That I was listening, and there's so many. It's just talk to anybody who's ever been part of a union. They'll have stories like this. They'll have stories where it's like, yeah, I told my boss to go fuck himself, and union just you can do that if you're part of a union, right? Or like, my boss told me this, and I said, fuck no, I'm not doing that. Talk to my union rep, and like that's just how that situation was handled. Oh, boss tried to fire me. Well, guess what, bitch? I'm part of a union, and you can't just fire me for no fucking reason. Or like, oh, my healthcare plan is so much better than other people who don't have union coverage, or like I have this much benefits and vacation days, and my pay package is very just like all of these different benefits in association with union organizing, and not necessarily like worker ownership. In fact, I mean, honestly, I guess this is different from a cooperative model, but like if you were to look at, for instance, how employee-owned businesses operate, where there's a good number of businesses in the country that are employee-owned, but it's owned through an employee stock ownership plan, where essentially you'll have, and what'll end up happening is you'll have like two tiers of employees, typically speaking. You'll have like the owner employees who are tenured enough to actually be part of the ownership of the company, and then you'll have like the non-ownership employees who aren't tenured enough. And there's just all these problems, right? Where it's like they're incentivized to basically create that two-tiered structure. Some socialists will even recommend that. They'll say like, oh, one way to deal with the fact that you have to buy into ownership is don't make people buy into ownership and just have them, qualify for ownership after 2 years. And it's like, yeah, but that's a worse situation for workers' rights than if workers were just represented by a union, at least in my opinion, And so I think that's where a lot of socialists like Yui and Lonerbox and Vosh and people like that come from. They had like this very strong critique of the workplace, and I think frankly they kind of, I think that they think that unions just aren't enough, and it just like from everything that I've ever read and anything that I've ever experienced dealing or like working with or hearing the stories of like union employees, unions are just like pretty good at solving basically all the critiques of the workplace. So.
Yeah, I mean, I can also speak to this. I was in a union for 2 years up until like this past December. It was fantastic. Like there'd be things where I would get a request come across my desk, and I would just be able to be like, yeah, no, that's outside the scope of my job description. I'm not doing it, and I could just do that instead of being forced to do things that were like so far outside what I was hired for that I was unqualified to do and would have screwed up, and it would have been my fault.
Yeah, I don't get that in my job. I just have to do everything. So
the reason we don't show your face in videos is because of your job. So
yeah. I do think it's interesting too, like unions, they breed like a very strong sense of solidarity that I think a lot of people sleep on. Like my dad, very conservative guy, like generally votes conservative. I think I've kind of pushed him to vote for the Social Democratic Party here now over the years. Just through his pure-blooded hatred for the Liberal Party, I've been able to push him farther left without him realizing. But he was in a union like most of his adult life. And I remember telling him when I was in university, I had a teacher, the profs were like going to go on strike, or like the contract instructors were going to go on strike. Yeah. And my contract instructor was like, yeah, I'm going to cross the picket line and come in and teach anyway. My job is I owe you guys, like I don't care about the union or whatever. And I remember telling my dad that, and my dad was like, conservative guy, like mouth agape. He was like, you can't do that. Like he was like shocked that someone would cross a picket line. Like, so yeah, I feel like not solves. Like I still think that obviously we have like that back end, anti-private capital critique on the other side of things to make sure that there's not like an Elon Musk coming in and buying an election, things like that. But it's like there can be a structured hierarchy for the worker democracy side of things.
Well, actually, I just want to stop you there, Bob, because I was just watching one of your videos before this where you mentioned like that specific issue of like rich people being able to like just buy their way into things. Uh-oh.
Hello?
Oh,
Yeah. Okay.
you're
You're
good.
back.
Oh yeah. No, sorry. I thought you were talking to Bob there for a second.
No,
Oh,
no,
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 sorry.
no.
Yeah.
That's all you.
Toss never
No,
do
no,
that.
yeah. I mean, no, I was gonna say that that's, you hear, and I think I should probably write about this at some point. It's like on the back burner, but you hear from a lot of like very wonk kind of center left people about unions, and like they'll bring out like papers that'll say like, oh, public sector unions are bad, and like this is the effect on productivity, and like, look at there's some news stories where unions look bad. They'll be like, oh, like look at this union that prevented like the adoption of this technology or this and that. And it's like, look, I mean, I think that a lot insofar as that happens, I think a lot of it is like how you set up the institution of the union itself. But I think that as well, one thing I feel like this never really gets talked about in response to articles like that is like people want to argue the merits of that, but I think that there's also a conversation outside the merits of that where, look, there's just like intangible benefits to having unions, right? And like that's kind of what we've been talking about, that it's not clear that an economic study would necessarily capture these intangibles, right? Like being able to just tell your boss to fuck off, and like having like recourse when your boss is acting in an unjust way, the stability of like union contracts and those kind of things, just like being able to know what your pay is going to be, and your kind of like pay scale, and like this kind of like more structured hierarchy, and knowing how all of that works in a very transparent fashion instead of this like distributed negotiation process, which favors the employer. Unions, like you said, that unions tend to create seemingly some kind of sense of solidarity amongst workers, and like cross solidarity amongst workers. I remember I had a similar story where I was telling my grandma about like Nordic labor unions and how they have all these like secondary strikes, and she was like, "Man, that's great. I wish we could do that here. That sounds awesome."
I
And she's the same thing, like very conservative woman. Unions tend to be uh, community institutions as well, right?
Yeah.
That it seems like unions do a lot of local community organizing, and it seems like people really appreciate union leadership in the community. And I guess that in part that's, unions are incentivized to do that, to recreate their own success. It's like, if we want workers to support unions, we have to be out in the community. We have to be out organizing ourselves. It just creates I guess, generally a much more democratic, like solidaristic culture, which is a little bit hard to capture in, an economic study, I guess, which is something worth mentioning.
It's a much more symbiotic relationship. Like one helps the other, and that it's just a positive feedback loop that it creates.
Yeah. It's also like, this is something I think I've seen Matt Bruenig talk about online as well, where sometimes people will point out these stories where a union goes on strike, like whatever it is, like waste management, postal service, whatever. They go on strike, and obviously it's disruptive, right? And it goes on for a prolonged period of time, and people are complaining. People like Matt Iglesias and like other like kind of centrist, like center left people being like, oh, I like unions in theory, but isn't this just the worst? And I think like the argument that Matt Bruenig has deployed, and something I think about a lot, is like the disruption here, for some reason, here in like Western countries where we don't really do unions so much anymore, like we put the onus on the workers, right? But I think he's kind of made the point in the past that, well, in a country like Norway, they don't really have these kind of disruptions, because when the post office goes on strike, so does every other like union in solidarity. So this thing gets resolved in like a day, rather than, one minor disruption that can carry on for 3 weeks. Or like you try to just wait out the other side. There's really no option to wait out labor over there. You're going to lose. And so like, yeah, I don't know. It's people trying to trot out this argument saying like, oh, well, we can't give unions more power because, they'll go on strike and it'll like stagnate things. And it's like, well, actually, I think if we were all unioned up, we'd probably be able to resolve these a lot faster.
Really need more power, actually, because you'll end up in situations like, I think it's resolved now, but here in Canada, where our postal service was just not working for like weeks because the company that runs it is more concerned about paying their executives than the workers.
Yeah.
And the government agrees with the company.
Some people will point out that like, oh, in Nordic societies, that they're very high trust societies, and there's kind of a chicken and egg debate in the economic literature, which is, what essentially, is it the high trust society which enabled them to have such a high rate of unionization and such a productive relationship between labor and capital, or is it the labor struggle itself which developed over the course of 100 years, which has like ended up being productive because we're standing on the shoulders of the giants of labor organizers who just had to fight all those fights for so long? And I don't know. I mean, my read of the history is it seems to be very much the latter, right? That it seems like when you look at the history of labor organizing and union organizing in Nordic countries, it's not like a bunch of workers were just like, oh my goodness, we should start a union, and then a bunch of capitalists in the Nordic countries were like, that sounds fine with me, dude, just fucking go for it. Like, no, it was a very fucking difficult process as well. Um, and it just seems like, they've had this. I mean, it's like 100 years worth of union organizing and labor organizing, where at this point there's such a robust institutional framework for that process that yeah, it seems, it's very calm and cool and collected now, and the organizing for both strikes and capital negotiation is robust, but you have to fight those fights, right? I mean, it's a transitionary process, and it's similar to like the transition pre-Obamacare to post-Obamacare. It led to a lot of coverage confusion. It led to a lot of people like having to switch their doctors, which was really controversial. And that sucked, right? But now we're in an equilibrium where we had this huge Medicaid expansion, and that ended up being an incremental improvement. And this is what you see with other healthcare systems across the world is like when they socialize their healthcare, well, fuck, like that turns out that's a pretty complicated process. But it's still, we end up in a better spot than we were before, even though we have to go through this rocky transition. So it's the juice seems to be worth the squeeze if you're just willing to go for it.
Yeah, for sure. I think in the Nordic case, I remember hearing, like, I guess Ben Shapiro was the first person I ever heard like trot out this argument that it's just because it's a majority white country, right? Like all the Nordics, they're majority white. That's why their
favorite
system works.
argument.
Well, I'm like,
those are one of my favorites.
To the extent that the argument makes any sense at all is like I can understand how it might be harder to like form a union when people are like of different races and maybe different cultures or whatever, but once you have them, like it doesn't seem like anything to do with race has any impact on the fact that these countries are happy, or like that their wages are higher, or that the unions do their thing. Like it just seems like it doesn't. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. Unless I think if you ask them to expand on it, they kind of just have to get racist with it after a while.
It's
like
there's
just
into
no
race science.
Yeah, there's no
100%.
way.
Yeah, it's really stupid. Obviously, I usually just ask the question in debates, and that gets brought up. It's like, tell me what is it about black people where we just can't have unions because they're in the country, right?
Yeah,
like,
what is it about
it just seems like
all being white? What is it that you think is better about that? Because it's telling.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's obviously it is very absurd, and I think as well, people are right to point out that look, if you have an actually nuanced understanding of the history of Nordic societies, that these aren't entirely homogenous societies. There's a lot of different cultural dialectical differences between these people. Yes, obviously they're white in some like race science sense, but this is a culturally diverse area. The Finnish, obviously they had a civil war. The Finnish Civil War happened a lot closer to modern time than the U.S. Civil War, right? And so that was a really bloody affair. And so these are not people that didn't have cultural differences or like differences in political persuasion or like militancy internal to their societies, right? So that's obviously pretty ridiculous. I think as well, if we're just going to make a descriptive claim and just say collective action problems are more difficult insofar as communities are more diverse, like that's probably true. But that's not an argument about unions or like welfare or socialism as institutions that just can't work. You're just saying, it's just harder if they're diverse, and it's like, well, maybe that is true, but that's not a comment on whether or not we should try to do it or whether or not those institutions are desirable. But that's a very rare thing. Yeah, like people will just, there's like a set of like maybe like 5 or 6 different arguments that you always hear wheeled out, and they're always wheeled out by people who have only done surface level reading into these things, right? It's like those societies are homogenous. Those societies are small, big numbers, so therefore it's harder to do these things. Some people will say those society, they can only do that because of U.S. military spending, and that subsidizes them, or they can only do that because like their healthcare systems only work because of the capitalist U.S. healthcare system, which subsidizes their innovation expenditures. And it's just like there's not really there's no great evidence or logic for any of these claims, but they're just, there's a lot of people who don't know what they're talking about, talking to a lot of people who also don't know what they're talking about, And so if you're one of these people who just has an intuition of like, yeah, the Nordic societies seem good. I mean, what's wrong with them? And you find yourself in a debate with a guy like Ben Shapiro, of course he can rattle off like 5 or 6 different things that sound sensible, because all those points sound sensible, but if you really start to think about them, they kind of fall apart if you've done, available reading. So you just have to, be prepared for that. You see guys like Ben Shapiro, it's a constant criticism, and I think it's sensible. Guys like Ben Shapiro, Charlie Kirk, there's a reason why they're going on to random college campuses, and they don't, it seems like they don't really want to debate, thinkers basically about these things, right? So they're probably not very comfortable with it.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing I just noticed when you were talking about that there, in that there seems to be a common thread amongst people of that like right-wing ideology, that even in terms of like urban design things, you'll hear arguments for North America of like, oh, well, we can't have cities that are like walkable and bikeable over here because we're too big, or like various things like that. And it's like, it's the exact same reasoning. They're just copying and pasting it onto a completely different topic, and it's just as meaningless in that context too.
Yeah, it's always different things are different. They don't want to actually expand on why.
And also, like, we can't do hard things. We've never done that. Humans are terrible at solving complex problems.
Yeah, exactly. And so you see all these dumb critiques, I think, of like socialism and socialist systems. I guess you also hear like the government, like, oh, but the government's authoritarian, I guess. That's like a fun one that you'll hear sometimes. And it's like, oh yeah, but I guess it just goes back to the point that we made earlier of like, oh, the government's authoritarian, but I'm totally comfortable with them being in charge of nuclear weapons. It's like, dude, how does this make, like, you're worried about the authoritarian government healthcare system, but not like the same exact people managing the nuclear weapons of society? Like, how do we square these two things?
And they're cheering on the Gestapo, like.
Yeah, well,
dude, obviously.
We also, like, I remember during COVID hearing this a lot, where people were saying, we can't let the government do stuff like force us to wear masks or whatever, because when has the government ever given up power? And I remember being like, all the time, like, what are you talking about?
Regularly.
Like, when, obviously, like, wartime powers come in, and a lot of times they go away. Like, what are you talking about? Like, what, you think we're just going to be wearing masks forever? To what end? Like, the people have a very, like, sinister view of government that I just find really confusing. I don't know how to talk them out of it. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I don't even know how to engage with that, because it's just like, I don't know how to engage with someone who's ignoring reality. That way. Like,
I mean, I think people look, if a libertarian, if a libertarian wants to just say like, look, I just feel like the government is bad, and I feel like the government just shouldn't be involved in these kind of things, it's like, okay, I mean, sure, I mean, to me, that doesn't strike me as a very robust reason for being in favor of a thing, or like at least having such a strong opinion about it. But you'll find that a lot of libertarians, they'll try to have, and I guess credit to them, but it just doesn't work out. They'll try to have very robust like philosophical reasons, or they'll try to have like an actual empirical discussion. It's impossible to have that, right? Like, impossible to have the argument. I mean, in one of the threads that I pointed out earlier, one of the guys was like, anytime the government expands, authoritarianism always follows. Look at North Korea, Pol Pot. This is a pretty classic. Like, look at Cuba. Look at all these authoritarian governments, and it's like, but hey, motherfucker, like, if you looked at, it's like, I was like, you know what governments also expanded? The UK and the Nordic countries and fucking Germany after, like, even after World War II, the government still expanded. Like, the US, Canada, all these societies have had a huge expansion in like the amount of government services that are provided on the local, state, national level. And wouldn't you know it, like, Australia's still a democracy, right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't you know it? Like, it's just this weird thing where when the government provides healthcare, that doesn't mean that the government's gonna like stop your ability to vote for things, right? I mean, come on, democracy just, it turns out that a lot of these institutions are very robust. And I guess people also make the argument that, there's some, I think a pretty reasonable socialist argument is like, hey, like, by democratizing these things, you're like decreasing the amount of authoritarianism in those very same institutions, that insofar as you're worried about like the power of a particular institution, like, oh, like the healthcare, like, oh, I'm worried about like the government being autocratic with our healthcare distribution. Well, I mean, I can tell you this: you don't have shit for rights when it comes to a private healthcare provider.
Yeah.
Like, you don't
Yeah.
have any of those. Like, they can just deny you coverage. Like, there's regulations and stuff, obviously, but there's a difference between like the state regulating a force that is like literally incentivized to prevent you from accessing it or over consuming it, to at the very least, constrained resources. You have to have managed models of distributing things, but at least in a public system, it is democratic. Like, you do have a vote and a say in how it's organized instead of just like private shareholders. So you'll find, I think, in my experience as well, like a lot of libertarians have basically anti-democratic beliefs as well. Like, they'll say like, oh,
Oh
no,
yeah.
democracy is
Yeah, big time.
democracy itself is like a form of coercion. But I wrote an article that was one of my libertarian philosophy articles where I was like, how can a libertarian say democracy is coercion but not a market? Like, when I go into the store, I'm not I didn't like choose all that shit to be on the shelves. Like, I just showed up, and like the collective market decided that that was the shit that was going to be on the shelves. When I shop at a mom and pop grocery store and like Walmart moves into town, you might say, but that's better for the community because Walmart's charging lower prices and this and that. It's like, but wait a second, but I didn't choose that Walmart to cause the mom and pop to go out of business. That was the community choosing that through the market, right? I mean, you can't say that, like, oh, like the market is voluntary, but democracy isn't. Like, no. These are both involuntary institutions that you have a very small part in, determining, I guess, what ultimately ends up happening because of you're just like one small part of like the whole collective. But at the very least, we can say that with a democratic process, that power's horizontal. Like, you don't have like 10 times less say as someone else because they just happen to have more money than you, right? That's how the market works. It's not necessarily how democracy works. So, it's a very, I don't know. Libertarians, what can I say, guys?
That's the worst.
Oh, they are the worst. And especially at like high levels when you get to like Peter Thiel kind of people, where like I don't even want to go further than saying his name because he drives me so nuts. But I do love, I love the like low level libertarians.
Like, well, I
like New Hampshire.
well, I can appreciate like the civil liberties stuff. Sometimes I'll join arms with the
that's
guys
the
at
thing.
Reason
Like,
to be like, maybe
yeah.
some of these wars we're funding, maybe not so good. And then we did a second channel video where we just reacted to something they did about Luigi Mangione, where I think the title of the Reason video was something like oh, the case is not what you think it is, or something like that. And I was like, I'm so excited to hear what a libertarian can possibly like rationalize the Luigi Mangione case as. Like, what could possibly have pushed him to do this in their frame of mind? And their argument was that on college campuses a few years ago, it was pushed on them that words are violence, and therefore, delay, deny, defend, these things that people say about health insurance, those are words, and Luigi decided those words were dangerous, therefore he can respond with violence. And I was like, this is like an insane way to like avoid talking about the healthcare system. Like, it's, I don't know, the libertarian mind is like a beautiful thing to me sometimes.
Yeah, it's really
Yeah, I
interesting.
think Matt Bruenig said he's.
Oh, sorry, I'll just
I won't wait.
we keep talking over each other. Well, I do agree. Like, liberty is a nice thing. The core of my belief is just like, yeah, you should just be able to do whatever you want as long as you don't harm others. Like, that's kind of core of it.
Yeah.
But my agreement with libertarianism stops there.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you.
No, I was gonna say Matt Bruenig made a joke a while ago where he said that he's like, libertarians, they have, the problem is that they're not autistic enough. He's like, I'm a socialist. I'm fully autistic, right? Libertarians, they're like 75% autistic, and that's just that they're far enough to reject a lot of our current system, but they're not far enough autistic to like fully embrace socialism, which I thought was pretty funny. Anyway.
So I guess that's a good segue. I wanted to ask you, like, tell us about when you were back in your filthy liberal days when you were debating all these socialists, and you talked to Matt Bruenig, and you mentioned like he kind of had the most coherent model. Like, tell the people, like, what was it that like persuaded you to be like, okay, maybe this socialism stuff can actually work?
Yeah, I think a lot of Matt Bruenig, he and I actually have a remarkably similar background. He did debate in high school, and I guess I don't know actually what he really did when he was an undergrad or anything like that, but he did debate in high school, and I guess that kind of primed him for being more argumentative, and I guess like being a little bit more adept at like argumentation as a process itself. And so one of the things that he did during our discussion, which he did a couple of things that I think were pretty unique, right, in terms of my conversations with a lot of socialists, is that number one, he framed socialism as kind of a narrow definition, but also pluralist in nature. So one thing that he did was he said, look, socialism, a lot of people add in a lot of stuff to socialism, and it's not necessarily unreasonable to do, but it's also not unreasonable to have a narrow definition. Like I think a lot of people, and I've saw, of course, even in the article where I explained this, there were some socialists in my replies that were like, "What you're describing isn't real socialism because of this." And it's like, oh my god, dude, like come on. And so, fuck that. So he basically said, look, socialism is collective ownership of the means of production, right? Like that's a very orthodox definition of socialism. Some people will say socialism is like collective ownership of production and and collective, by collective I mean workers, and you have to decommodify everything, and you have to fully reject like capitalism as a framework and a process. Just like all these different things. And he's like, look, I think socialism is just when you collectively own things, own production, I guess that is. And when it comes to um, the reason why that's like a productive way to frame things is because you end up getting bogged down in a lot of arguments with socialists of like what is really socialism. And if he basically just comes in and says, look, I think socialism can look like a lot of different things. This is what I mean when I say socialism, and this is kind of what I'm recommending. You kind of avoid an unproductive discussion about what it really means to be socialist in nature. I found myself even falling into that with conversation with socialists. Like, I had like debated so many worker democracy socialists that like I just kind of presumed that socialism is when workers own the means of production. And I think there was only like one socialist, like in the dozens of socialists that I debated, there was only I think one socialist before Matt that kind of like disagreed with this framing and said, no, like socialism, and I don't think they did quite as good of a job as Matt, so it didn't resonate with me at the time. But like, no, socialism really is just different forms of collective ownership. Ultimately, it could be worker ownership, it could be social ownership, it could be like you could say government ownership or state ownership, things like that. It really just kind of depends on the socialists, but you could imagine a society with many different sort of socialist models of production, and I think that's a pretty sensible way to think about it. And the next thing that he did was he also framed socialism on the institutional level. So a lot of times when you're talking to socialists, again, very unproductive way to have the conversation is, well, what are the countries that you really defend? Like, oh, some socialists will just say like, oh, like Cuba and China and Vietnam, and it's like, okay, well, I think you end up giving a lot of ground to capitalists in debates like that because I think intuitively, look, these societies are just not the best places to live, and it's because of a lot, in a large part, like due to the way that they set up their institutions. Like, you can always talk about imperialism or like with Cuba, like the embargo it's a very sensible to say that a big reason why Cuban people are poorer than they otherwise would be is because of the embargo. Of course, that's true, but the part of the fixed effect of the material condition of a lot of these places is also clearly how they set up their own institutions, and those things could be improved. And when it comes to setting up socialism at the institutional level, you can kind of avoid all of these different arguments about whether a country is or is not socialist, whether a country itself, like defending an entire country's economic system, by saying, look, socialism, because it's just collective ownership, we can see that societies are made up of different socialist and capitalist institutions. In America, Matt will often use the school system, which I think is a very sensible example. Look, we could have privately owned, for-profit, market-distributed schools, but we don't. Like, we have like publicly owned, like democratically operated schools. Like, that's a socialist way of organizing education, right? It's just a completely, essentially decommodified, publicly owned entity, right? And so the fire department, police, the military, every society has some like minimal level of social ownership. And some societies, like Matt would say, like the Nordic societies, they have a lot of social ownership, right? And he would say that those societies are better because of their high levels of social ownership. So those are two different ways, socialism is kind of narrowly defined, but also pluralist in nature. But also socialism can also exist like on an institutional level and not necessarily always have to be a discussion about like country level socialism or capitalism, because those debates can be kind of confused. So he productively kind of like defined his terms. And then by defining your terms that way, you kind of force capitalists to really think hard, like a lot harder, I think, at that point. It's like, okay, you're right. Like, I guess, like, when we think of like Walmart is a capitalist institution because it's privately owned and operated in the market. And then when we think of public schools are kind of a socialist institution because they're publicly owned and operated outside of the market. It's like, okay, well, then why should it be the case that we have private shareholders for Walmart, right? And I don't think I was like super unprepared to answer that question, but that's a much harder question, I think, for the average person to answer than, oh, like, is Cuba a good place to live or not? Like, that's like I think a lot people have like a lot more priors for a question like that than like, why should Walmart be privately owned but public schools be publicly owned? And then, like we talked about, the last thing that he did in that conversation was he had a very like, touching grass model of socialism, where his model is very focused on the sovereign wealth fund as an institution. And it's a pretty easy thing to defend. Like worker democracy socialists, they kind of rely on pretty narrow examples, right? Like, oh, this one company in Spain is like a pretty big worker cooperative, or this region in Italy has like 10% of the people there work for cooperatives, or look at the transportation sector in Chile where 40% of the transport, it's like, dude, what the fuck? These are not big examples. Like, this is like, you probably would want to have a few more empirical examples before basing your like entire economic model off of it. Whereas Matt can come and say, there's fucking tens of thousands of different sovereign wealth funds in the world. Insofar as a sovereign wealth fund is just a publicly owned investment firm, there's all kinds of pension funds and state level sovereign wealth funds and national sovereign wealth funds. And, Dag Detter, the book that I read, which was a supplement to what Matt talked about, like, there's public holding corporations and there's tens of thousands of state-owned enterprises and state services, like public schools that he mentioned. Like, it's like there's so many examples that you can look at from Matt's worldview where you can say, hey, at the very least, this is actually existing on the macro level in a lot of places. And so when Matt comes in and says, I kind of want to just do that, but multiply it, by 3 or 4, it's like, that's like a way, way more intuitive, sort of understandable model to me, at least, than I want to take like the worker cooperative model and multiply it by like 100,000. It's like, oh man, like that's a much harder thing to even like imagine the transition of or happen, right?
It's
Versus
much more
like,
in
no,
the
I
realm
just
of
want the government.
reasonability. Yeah.
It seems more reasonable, yeah, fundamentally, I guess, right? It doesn't seem as nearly as big of a leap.
Yeah, I remember I got into, like, we've never done any debates, and I don't know if that's really my style. Maybe someday, if it comes down to it, I'll argue with someone. But like, I got into this with like a friend. We're just doing a beach day, and someone mentioned like, oh, this is why billionaires shouldn't exist. And this one guy jumps in and goes, I think they should. And I like flipped the switch. I became like one of these guys online who does this. And I was just like laying out the Bruenig model, where I was like, everything that, and he was making this case like, oh, you need innovation, you need private investment, whatever. And I was just making the case like, guys, everything that, all this stuff that you're talking about, like investment, innovation, these things happen under like public money all the time. Like Matt Bruenig wrote a bunch of stuff at the time.
Actually.
Well, yeah, I mean, like historically in the U.S., innovation was much higher when there was more public investment. Mm-hmm. But like even in Norway, like under the public sector, like not even just public funds into private enterprises, but like just in their own public money, like they innovate all the time. And just because it's a small country, we don't necessarily see it all the time. But like I think Matt Bruenig had a whole piece of it, like patent for patent, like proportionally they actually do more innovation over there, and it seems to be because of like their robust public sector. Yeah. But I remember I was like arguing with this guy, and he seemed to be under the impression that like Mark Zuckerberg and like Elon Musk are like, and people like that are personally like deciding where their money goes and like where the general direction of the economy. And I was trying to explain that like most of this money is like decided on like by like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, right? Like, and it doesn't really make sense to me why, if those companies were just owned by the government, why anything would really run differently. The only difference would be that a couple assholes don't get all the money at the end of the day. You can kind of redistribute it. Like, it seems like the model's always been there, especially as capital has been concentrating more and more. Like, we know that small groups can manage large amounts of capital. I don't see why it can't just be a sovereign wealth fund or something like that.
And especially in that case of, like, if like a BlackRock and like those things were run instead of by private people as corporations, they were run as institutions. The other thing I have with that is that, well, now they're also able to be run in a way that's not at conflict with what they're supposed to be doing. For example, if you have like a transit agency, it can't operate properly as a transit agency if its goal is to make a profit. Because now its goal isn't moving people, its goal is making profit.
Right.
And those are not always in concert with each other.
Yeah, not everything should be. Yeah, certainly not everything should be a for-profit entity. I mean, that's one of the, that's a good a classic libertarian argument. It's like, hey, do you think the police would run better if it was for-profit? Now, some libertarians would just say yes, absolutely yes. But I think that kind of that breaks down some of that profit. That breaks down, I think, some of that mindset. But insofar as things like running for profit under market pressure create innovation, like that's, I think that's one thing that Matt even did in this conversation where, I think in part I went into that conversation like, I don't know, it seems like these private investors allocating capital, like it does seem to have some, that does seem to be like a good fundamental process. But then Matt, again, he turns it on the head by saying, yeah, but if we're just talking about a process where people allocate capital, like he would just say like, well, I would agree that that's entrepreneurial activity. That's like a thing that certainly creates value. But the question is, does that process have to be privately owned, right? And insofar as it is privately, or insofar as it's publicly owned, like what does that look like? Similar to people will bring up things like pharmaceutical innovation. It's just the exact same thing. It's like the people doing the research in the labs are not capitalists. They're not, it's not like Tony Stark who fucking is just like billionaire genius guy who's like discovering elements and stuff. Like it's a bunch of scientists who spent their whole life studying a subject who are on a salary, right?
Exactly.
And insofar as somebody like, like a pharmaceutical executive is really good at pitching the drug and is really good at, convincing people to invest in something, that entrepreneurial activity, well, is it the case? And of course the answer could be no, it could be yes to this, but like, is it the case that process just can't happen if it's a collectively owned, like horizontally owned thing? Like, I don't really think the intuitive answer to most people is like, no. People will say, well, okay, well now my objection becomes significantly more practical in nature. That, oh yeah, sure. Like even my co-host on the Three Wonks podcast, which is now defunct, but we ended the podcast, I don't know, a month or so ago. But like my co-host Micah, who is a neoliberal or like a new liberal, whatever he'd call himself, like a center left kind of guy. Like even he would say like, look, in theory, total public ownership, optimal, right? It's definitely an optimal way to do things because you're horizontalizing ownership and power and profits, and it's more democratic, and you're internalizing externalities, and there's like intrinsically a lot of reasons to say like, strictly speaking, public ownership is preferable, but practically speaking, it doesn't work. And so that was kind of where the conversation that I had with Matt, where it's like, okay, my brain's kind of been opened up. My heart and my brain have been open to the possibility of socialism, and at least I can take like this model and this argument pretty seriously. And it was a very challenging discussion. But that was also like the end of the road at that point for me as well. It's like, okay, well, practically speaking, I just don't know if it works. And to be critical of Matt, like I think that I don't even know that Matt would necessarily disagree with anything that I added on in the part 3 of the article that I wrote about like why I became a socialist, why I proposed my own model. But Matt, I think that was the answer that he didn't have in that conversation that I really was looking for, is like, okay, well, but Matt, it just seems like when the government socializes all investment, you do get problems, right? Like it does seem like there's problems with like misallocation of capital, like overemployment and like bureaucratic, like administrative management and like all of these like social political objectives kind of being injected into state ownership, and so they end up running inefficiently. Politicians being on the boards of these state-owned enterprises because not because they're qualified to like run an oil company, right? But because they're basically it's just a political favor, right? And it's like, okay, well, there's a lot of historical evidence that that is a real problem with public ownership of assets. And so that's where I think I couldn't really, he wasn't like, he didn't completely flip me in that conversation. But then that's where I think I kind of came to my ultimate view from like a normative perspective and saying, Matt has a pretty sensible model. I don't know that it works because of the whole like government owning all the social, like government owning everything thing. I don't know if it'll work because of all the practical kind of problems with that. But I think there are a lot of normative arguments for socialism. And then on the practical side, it was actually a book recommendation by Matt. He said, you should read, he was talking to his audience. He was like, you guys should read this book called The Public Wealth of Cities by Dag Detter. And Dag Detter had wrote a couple of books about public wealth management. It sounds like a very dry topic, I guess, but he wrote these books about how to manage public wealth very effectively. And I was like, this to me actually is the best answer. This is like a whole 2 books basically on how to manage public wealth in a way that's, optimal. And I think that's what kind of got me to the practical socialist model that I think could actually be pretty workable. But then the actual thing that convinced me of socialism wasn't necessarily Matt's conversation, just kind of opened my eyes to it. It was all these normative arguments about like why equality is really important and why socialism is probably the best way to actually achieve equality. And, I think those are the things that I think really kind of got me to say, like, look, I think socialism as an ideal makes sense. And then Dag Detter comes in with the assist to Matt Bruenig's argument that I needed to take a more practical stance.
So it's funny you mentioned that like it's kind of dry, and I'm sitting here frantically typing in the title of the book to find it. But now just to talk about the book a little bit more because I'm curious, is this just abundance but good?
I guess that's kind of a funny way to frame it. You could definitely frame this as like a very abundance tinted thing. Dag Detter, he's an investment banker by trade.
Yeah.
I don't know that he's a socialist. He did work for the Social Democrats. That was kind of
Okay.
I think that was like one of the selling points of this book, The Public Wealth of Nations. So The Public Wealth of Cities is actually a sequel to The Public Wealth of Nations. But I think really they're pretty much the same book, but they have just slightly different flavors, really. But I think they're both. It's kind of interesting to read them together, even though they have a lot of the same stuff. But Dag Detter was an investment banker, kind of finance professional who he got hired by the Social Democrats. But again, I don't know if he was like actually a member of the party or anything. But he got hired to basically be the head of a huge restructuring program that they were planning for the public wealth of the nation. So the Social Democrats had taken over from the conservatives in Sweden, and the conservatives had this policy of privatization because what they found, or what they saw, I guess, in their minds was like a huge amount of inefficiency and like over bureaucratization on account of state ownership in Sweden. And they had, in Sweden in the 90s, I think, I'm not totally familiar with the history, but Sweden in the 90s, I think, did have a lot of various economic problems. I think I'm not mistaken, I think they had pretty high unemployment. I think inflation was a bit of a problem. The conservatives, when they took office, they promised to fix it in part by privatizing public wealth. Of course, they did that. It didn't really seem to fix the problems. The Social Democrats take office, and they hire Dag Detter to help them with this. They say, look, we do think that part of the problem is the inefficient management of all these public assets. And part of a big chunk of the book is Dag Detter, without basically making it autobiographical, but he's essentially talking about his experience, but his historical analysis of what happened as informed by his own lens of being in charge of a lot of this process. And he talks about a few processes that they did that actually proved to be pretty effective at improving public wealth management. And one of Dag Detter's arguments, and this is where the abundance piece comes in, I guess you could say, is that governments, they manage a lot of their assets inefficiently, and they also a lot of the times don't manage the assets that they have at all, because they literally do not even realize how much money and wealth they have at their fingertips. And so one of the first things that he did when that the government engaged in when they started this process was they said, look, here's what we're going to do. We need to actually create a portfolio. Like we need a list. We need like a list of all of our public ownership. They just didn't have that. They're like, we have like state-owned enterprises here and there, and they're under this ministry, this portfolio, that portfolio. But we don't have an actual consolidated list of all of the shit that the Swedish government owns. And when they went through this like forensic accounting process and they said, okay, we're going to go like line by line, we're going to put everything the government owns in one portfolio and we can easily look it up. What they discovered was that the Swedish government had already like essentially mostly socialized the economy. That they knew that there was like a lot of public ownership in Sweden, but they didn't realize how ridiculous the scale of the public wealth was in Sweden. That like I think it's like the Wallensberg family or something like this. These are like the Waltons of Sweden, like a really really rich influential family of Sweden. The public ownership of Sweden like was several orders of magnitude greater than even like the richest family in Sweden by like a huge amount. And once they finally had their eyes, and the second step that they did, once they finally had their eyes on like all of the public wealth of Sweden, that made it easier to see what was and wasn't working. And so ironically, two things happened at once under the Social Democrats, right? The conservatives privatized about $30 billion worth of wealth during their administration. Now, because conservatives are incompetent and can't run anything, they ironically sucked at privatizing things because they didn't think to just consolidate a list of all the assets. They're like, well, we know that there's this big company here and that big company here. Let's just like privatize those things. So they privatized $30 billion worth of assets. The Social Democrats, they said, okay, well, we need a list of all the shit. And once they got that list, they also started privatizing things that were inefficient. They started like narrowing operations and like getting rid of a lot of the social goals and stuff like that. And they privatized 5 times more things as the conservatives by value. It was like $150 billion. But ironically, by making the operations of all of these state-owned enterprises transparent and by running them like commercial enterprises and like stripping away a lot of those social goals, the public's portfolio within that 3-year period was worth more than the $150 billion they privatized during that same period. Like they literally grew. Even when you account for the $150 billion of privatization, the public still was wealthier after that privatization because they were running things so much more efficiently as a government. And so this kind of leads to, I think, a couple of like key takeaways. Is like, number one, ironically, privatization doesn't necessarily mean that the public is not wealthier than before, because that's the same thing as like when you sell a stock, you might use that stock and put it in another stock that's like more valuable, so it appreciates at a faster rate. So that's an interesting takeaway. Number two, when you inject a lot of political management and political interference and social goals into public assets, it turns out that they run significantly worse, right? That like if you try to say that, hey, we're going to have an oil company and we're going to use the oil company as basically a jobs program, and well, we have a lot of political favors that we have to pay off, so we're going to make up a lot of vice president jobs and just like give them to a bunch of political people, to pay them a big salary, and also we're going to like massively subsidize like the cost of gasoline in our country because it's an oil company in an oil rich country. And so all of these things kind of add up to where it turns out like, oh shit, our supposed to be pretty profitable oil company is like not making nearly as much profit now. And that turns out to be bad for the people at large because those profits are socialized. So in theory, like the socialized profit from these corporations should be going to things like public infrastructure and public education and public health care and maybe basic incomes and welfare programs for people. And when we inject so many social goals and political interference into public wealth, well, now we have substantially less money for all of those things that we would think would be very important. So that's kind of the abundance piece, that by doing that, ironically, we have less money to achieve our social goals by injecting so many social goals into the public wealth institutions themselves. And so Detter ends up, and this is the last thing I'll say, because I've been going on for a while now, is that Detter, he says like one of the big things when it comes to public wealth is not to not have social goals. Like he doesn't recommend like,
Right.
oh, public schools should be run for profit, but just publicly owned. Like he says, no, no, no.
Right.
Like if you're gonna have things like libraries and schools and like a healthcare service or something like that, that just shouldn't be a commercial operation at all.
Yeah.
That if you're gonna have something like a public school, just make it a
Let
public
it be a
school.
public
Like
school.
don't yeah, like don't inject this arbitrary profit goal and say you're going to compete in the market, but then we're also going to have all these social goals on top. You should have commercial assets that are owned by the public that run commercially, and you're supposed to just make profit and do what you can. And then you should have non-commercial assets that are basically just government services. And this is one of the arguments that people make about the USPS in America, where they'll say, well, you know, it shouldn't matter that the USPS is profitable or not. It's just a government service. But it's like, okay, but therein lies the problem. Because I would agree that, hey, insofar as we just don't give a shit about the USPS making a profit because it's supposed to just be viewed as a government service, why are we saying it should make a profit then? Like, why isn't it just run as a pure government service? Because nobody thinks about, like, nobody thinks about, like, the military making a profit at the end of the year.
Yeah.
Like, maybe it makes some money, maybe it loses some money, but it's just a public service, right? It's not like an enterprise as well as a public service. So that's one of the key recommendations from Bagdetter as well.
Yeah, I think I've been seeing this a lot lately because everyone in the world's talking about Zoran Mamdani because he's about to become, the president of America or something. Like everyone's upset about this. But he has this public grocery store idea, right? And people were acting like him doing this would bankrupt the city. Like if he opens 3 grocery stores, it is the end of New York. I'm like, guys, it's number one, these exist in
New York City can afford to run a grocery store.
I think so. And like people are acting like, oh, well, the margins are really slim for grocery stores. I'm like, guys, he doesn't have to make
a transit agency too.
Well, yeah, he doesn't need to make a profit at all. But in this case, like if you were to run like something like the military, like you said, like the military doesn't bring in any money at all, really. It's just you spend the money for the social good. The grocery store at least it will bring in some revenue. Like it's not like they have to bankroll the whole thing. It's not like people are going to buy groceries. That's the fucking point. Like I can't imagine it's going to be I'm sure it'll lose money, but like it's not the end of the world. Sometimes the government loses money. That's just the way it works. That's what taxes are for.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think that and that's the thing, right? Is that like I don't know that a guy like Dag Detter would be super against the idea of like the public owning a grocery store. His whole point was that it's just if you're gonna own a grocery store and you're gonna say this grocery store is like just a public service and we don't really care that much about whether or not it makes profits or not, well then that should just be kind of the transparent understanding of that asset. That exactly. I mean, if it loses a little bit of money here and there, like maybe that's bad, and maybe we shouldn't have publicly run grocery stores, but we shouldn't really think of it as like that necessarily means that this asset isn't working well. And insofar as like we do have commercial assets, this shouldn't be included in that. Like this, the commercial assets of the government should be, operated completely separately, because it's just 2 different skill sets, right? Like, I think that it makes, insofar as we think that social goals should be accomplished by public assets, people who are mission focused and want to do social good are just a fundamentally different group of people from people who know how to make profitable ventures, right? And when we mix those 2 people together and we make them work together, or we cause, the profitable venture guy to start caring about social good, and we start making the social good guy start having to care about making a profit, you make both goals harder to achieve because, you're just not, at that point, it's just like basically you're not specializing your focus and your labor when you should. Let the guy who knows how to make profit, and let the guy who really knows how to connect with the community and do a social good, and you end up creating a system that's a lot more symbiotic because under a public under a public ownership model, the guy who's making profit is working for the public, right? He's just making profit for the public, And insofar as we care about social goals that need to be subsidized, like maybe something like a government-owned grocery store, well, we have a lot more money to do that if we allow the profit maximizers to do their work and maximize profits on the public's dime, like when it comes to public wealth. And so that's something that's worth really thinking about. That the compartmentalization of operations. A lot of socialists, I think they would hear something like that and they would say like, oh well, that's just that's a wolf in sheep's clothing basically. That's just capitalism, but it's different. And it's like, well, look, I mean, I don't. Some socialists are against profit and they are against market distribution, but look, I mean, if a capitalist, quote unquote, wants to work for a public institution and make, in aggregately speaking, Dag Detter points out to like trillions of dollars of money that's left on the table because of this like suboptimal management of public wealth. If a capitalist wants to come in and you want to say that that's just a capitalist process where the public's wealth is now making like trillions of dollars back for public investment in things like infrastructure and public schools and public healthcare and stuff, I mean, I don't know, I guess so. I mean, but it works whether or not you call it capitalism or socialism. Like, it's a very, very good thing to do.
That's a good statement too, and that like I think part of the thing that makes us not always call ourselves socialists is just that thing of like, I really don't care, I just want things to work better.
Yeah.
Like, whatever that looks like, I want there to be less suffering in the world. I want us to actually be using the resources and the wealth that we have to make sure everybody is supported, because I refuse to believe that we live in a world where that's not possible.
Yeah, I mean, I get, it frustrates me a little bit when people look at a model like that, which is basically like more or less what I would subscribe to, in that there's no more real private ownership, right? Everything is either run by the government directly, like something like a library, or you have like, certain things that are run in a market system, but ultimately the capital is still owned by the government and ultimately the profits redistributed through whatever mechanism. And like, my thought is, I get if you're like, oh, that's not socialism when it's all, everything has to run like the library for it to be socialism. I'm like, but in my system, there's no more capitalists. So if there's no capitalists, I just have a hard time wrapping my head around how it's like, I guess it comes down to, like you were mentioning earlier, there's like the workplace democracy socialists, there's like the decommodification socialists. Mine is like a model more around just like the capital itself. It's like, who owns what? And if there's no private individuals owning any substantial portion of the economy, I just don't see how that's still capitalism anymore. Like, I don't get it.
If the wealth distribution curve is looking a little like mostly flat, I
don't understand.
I don't even need for me, it doesn't even need to be flat. I understand that's probably not an achievable goal. I just want to flatten it a little bit.
Yeah. Well, that's again, I think you can trace the through lines, I think, pretty cleanly in terms of the models that people recommend, in the socialist canon, I guess. People who have a very robust critique of the workplace obviously will tend towards like workplace democracy, but then there's a lot of socialists who are like anti-market, or they're almost like Bruenig style like social ownership models with SOEs and like state services and stuff, where they're a much more egalitarian socialist, right? Where they'll say, look, I take egalitarianism and equality very, very seriously, and insofar as I take those things seriously, well then, what are just like the systems by which we can most equally distribute things without, sacrificing our other values to some radical degree, our sense of community, the consequences of our economic, like, do we innovate, do we grow in general? And so, those people are going to tend towards government services and state-owned enterprises because obviously, that's a much more distributionally equal thing to do, where the profits are flowing horizontally to society at large, rather than just private capitalists, rather than just the workers within individual firms, right? Because obviously some firms are significantly more capital intensive than others, right? Where you have millions of dollars of capital per worker in some firms, but then just a few thousands, if you're like, compare like a landscaping business to people who work at Apple, right? The people who work at Apple are going to necessarily be significantly more profitable per worker than people who own a landscaping business. So depending on what you take seriously, that's kind of what'll inform your socialist model. But, insofar as socialists aren't too antagonistic, I guess. I'm cool just saying, agree to disagree. I mean, obviously, whatever. We're all voting for AOC, hopefully. So it's not a
Well,
not a huge disagreement. I
it
guess.
seems like whatever. I once pitched this to a Trotskyist friend I have on Twitter, like, because he was asking me, he's like, I feel like you and I agree on a lot. I call myself like a Marxist and a Trotskyist, and you don't call yourself like either of those things. Like, why not? And I was like, well, I don't really know that. Number one, I just haven't read these books. I'm sorry, I haven't read that much of Marx. I haven't read any Trotsky at all. Like, I listened to State and Revolution years ago on audiobook. Like, that's the extent of it, right? So I was like, on that front, I'm not going to LARP as like some revolutionary when I'm just not reading these texts. I'm not going to pretend to have read them. But I was also like, my model, and I laid it out like basically very similar to what you lay out, where it's, I want public ownership in, a nationalist sense, like nationalizing these industries. But then there are certain things I would just let the sovereign wealth funds and the, government holding corporations manage. Things that make sense in the market. Ultimately, I just want to have the capital owned by the government. And I laid that all out for him. And I was like, would you take issue with this? And he was like, well, I guess that would probably be like my transition step to what I ultimately want. And I was like, yeah, so why do people like argue? Like, I'm sure most like communists would agree that, whatever is being described here would be a vast improvement. Like, it just, you'd kind of, disempower a lot of the bad actors in the market, right? Like the Elon Musks and the people like that wouldn't hold the power to resist whatever you're trying to accomplish, right? It seems like we're all working towards something here.
Yeah, I find like Trotskyists and like Marxist-Leninists to be kind of in a lot of senses like a confusing group of people, to me at least, right? And I haven't had a debate with one in a little while. I don't know what happened to them. I feel like the Marxist-Leninists just kind of they disappeared at a certain point. I don't know where they went.
Well, the Canadian political party, the two of them finally made amends and merged, I think.
Hey.
Because for a long time we had the Communist Party and the Communist Marxist-Leninist Party, and they hated each other, but now they're one party. So I don't know, maybe something's going on there.
Infighting.
So watch out, Econoboi. They're coming for you.
Right. They've merged.
That's right. No, but so I find them to be a little bit of a confusing group of people because, for instance, a lot of Marxist-Leninists will defend the current present day Chinese economic system, and that's if we're just ignoring their political institutions and we're just saying the way that the Chinese set up their economic institutions is like a good way to do that. It's like, okay, well then let's deconstruct that. How does China do that? They have, number one, a lot of private ownership, so I guess I don't know how we necessarily feel about that, but let's just ignore the huge amount of private ownership that they have for a second. They also have a lot of state-owned enterprises. They have like multiple sovereign wealth funds, and they have public like holding corporations and investment corporations, right? And so if we were to say, okay, well now let's look at the Nordic economies. They have a lot of private ownership. They have a whole shitload of state-owned enterprises. They have sovereign wealth funds, and they have public holding investment corporations, right? And if you talk to a Marxist-Leninist, they will say, okay, well, sure, whatever, right? But then we start talking about the political institutions, and now all of a sudden, it just feels a little bit odd because it feels like it's like, okay, look, if we like the Chinese economy, and the way that like China and Vietnam and like these societies, or Venezuela, like the way that these societies are set up, the way that those societies are set up economically speaking is very similar to the Nordics. Mm-hmm. And so if we're basically just saying, well, I like the Chinese government because like why? Like they call themselves communist? Like is that really like that can't be the reason. You can't say that as your reason because that sounds dumb. Because
the flag's the right colors though.
No, yeah, but hey, Norway has a red flag, so maybe that, but like, I'm just saying, like, we end up, then all of a sudden it's purely at that point a debate about the political institutions, and I don't know, I guess I find with Marxist-Leninists, like, I think free and fair democracy is just a lot more important, I guess. I guess Marxist-Leninists are also, they tend to favor like reform, they tend to favor revolution, as a way to socialize the economy. And I don't know, like that's one of the things that I think that's one of the things that's also eye-opening about Dag Detter's book is that it's just funny because it seems like the incremental approach of just socializing things here and there, expansion of public services here and there over time. And it's like a country like Sweden, it's like, oh shit, literally we've already socialized most things, right? And it's like you talk to a Marxist Leninist and they would say like that's literally not even possible. You can't do that under a liberal democratic framework. And it's like, well, they've already done that in some countries, right? Like in Norway, one of the articles that I wrote, in Norway, 2/3 of the wealth, 2/3 of all the wealth in the whole society is already socially owned in Norway. 2/3, right?
Yeah.
And so, when, I don't know, like when a Marxist Leninist says like, oh, that's just not possible, it's like, it doesn't sound like you're familiar with all the socialism that already exists around you. It turns out we've already socialized a whole lot in a lot of societies, and we've done so in a pretty mundane kind of sleeper fashion without realizing it. Which is, that's like, I guess that's the point of the books that Dag Detter, of course he's not a socialist, but that's like one of the fundamental points of Dag Detter's book is like, we've already socialized a shitload of stuff. We just haven't accounted for it yet.
I think it's interesting how many of these economists and bankers and whatever write books like this that socialists pick up and go like, right, you get it.
Yeah.
Because it's like, okay, so maybe these ideas are actually just like correct then. And maybe when someone like Mark Carney, who writes books like that, comes into power and starts doing the things that aren't in line with that, maybe we should look at that and go, hey, he's not actually working the public interest.
Yeah, well, I think I've read some like Mark Blythe and like watched some of his lectures. He's like a economics professor at Brown University, and as I understand it, he's like a liberal guy. He's a hoot. He's a fun lecturer, but maybe he's come around. Maybe he's just like a market socialist now. But he would do all these lectures where he'd be like, yeah, it sure seems like all the rich people own, all the market. It seems like that's kind of a problem. Like, and it seemed like everything he was like pointing towards, and he did like, the Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders kind of economic model. So I think he's like, at the very least, like a social democrat. But, I think a lot of those guys will kind of point in that general direction and kind of stop short of going all the way and saying, okay, we might as well just have the government do all this stuff and redistribute it. But I think if you're like an honest, and this is kind of something I wanted to talk to you about as well, like I just feel like if you are an honest liberal, like a truly you believe in like liberal democracy, and you like one person, one vote, you want a just society, and your dad, but like you believe in like egalitarianism, right? You believe that like we should have a more equal society. It seems like if you look into a lot of this stuff, I just don't know how you, at the very least, can't come to the conclusion that like, surely like at least Norway is kind of the move. Like surely at least social democracy is what you have to do. I just like have a really hard time wrapping my head around like I'll say his name again, like the Matt Iglesias kind of like center left-ish kind of viewpoint. It's like, well, we basically just have to keep doing what we've been doing since the 80s. And it's like, I just don't think that's true.
Say it with me. Better things aren't possible.
Literally, that's like the argument. Like, it's better. It's just not possible ever. And I'm like, I don't know how you guys aren't striving at least for the social democracy.
I don't know. I find with a lot of center left people, like I was never particularly centrist in my worldview. Like I was always in favor of like I basically from like this last year, I guess, like I went from saying Norway is ideal to saying I think we can do even better than Norway, basically. And I think why a lot of people think like, okay, well, Norway, I don't know about Norway, is like center left people will come up with some excuses. Like they'll say, I think this is a minority view, but like some people will say like, oh, well, that it's an oil rich country. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, well, literally America's an oil rich country, right? So that doesn't really work. And and it's like, just forget about oil. Like America's just resource rich, just like period. So
just rich, flat out.
It's like, we're just rich. It turns out, like we're a rich society.
Like Canada's a wealthy nation. Doesn't even come close.
No, well, I was gonna say even like Finland has like nothing going on, and they managed to pull off this social democracy thing pretty well.
Doesn't have homelessness.
Yeah, like they have no resources, and yet it works. Like I don't know.
And so that's obviously a really I don't find that to be a great objection, but that's kind of a minority view. Like I said, I think a lot of them will say that, look, ultimately you have like the risk of a suboptimally set up public institutions. Like people like Mike, I said, like people like him will say socialism would work if it could work, basically. Like it would be great
That's a good
if
point.
like the government could actually
Yeah,
be
man.
trusted to
Most
well, if the
things
government could be trusted to like do it, basically is what they'll say. And so they'll say like, no, instead of the government doing that, like people like Ezra Klein, like they'll say the government should set up this institution of like optimal regulations, and the government should have these like kind of fiscal transfers where you have this like optimal tax code and this optimal spending code, and like that's a much better way to do things. And it's like, yeah, but the thing is, abundance already says, and many center left thinkers already agree, the government doesn't do that shit right either, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
the government doesn't regulate things optimally. Our tax code isn't optimal. And insofar as our, like you believe in things like UBI and like, oh, like I'm in like an abundance liberal, and I'm not overly antagonistic to abundance people, but insofar as you believe in an optimal regulatory state, an optimal tax code, and an optimal fiscal system, number one, that is an ideal that every government in the world has failed at actually achieving. That insofar as we're making like a practical objection to social ownership, I could just as easily just say, well, hey, practically speaking, we're never going to get an optimal tax code. Clearly, we're never going to get an optimal regulatory state. Clearly, oh, you're going to point out to a country like Singapore that has that? Guess what? That's a small country, bitch. Okay, like it's like,
Small.
it's just like, yeah, it's like no, like obviously, like number one, those things are ideals that I agree with. That we should have optimal regulations and optimal tax codes and optimal transfer systems, but to say that your system is more realistic when I can point to a lot of imperfect examples of public ownership and a lot of optimal examples of public ownership, but your system's more optimal when basically every country fails at achieving your ideal, like I think that's a little bit unreasonable. And then number two, what I always try to point out, there was a guy on Twitter who actually he had this like weird, very bizarre back and forth. You'll find that people tend to reject the compatibility of these views sometimes, or they just don't recognize it. Where it's like, look, guess what? Like socialism is really about the ownership. Like you could be a socialist and believe in an optimal tax code and an optimal fiscal system and an optimal set of regulations. Like those are actually completely compatible with a social ownership model, right? Like, hey, the companies that the public would own would still interact with regulations and the tax code, and we would still need welfare in a social society, right? And so these are completely compatible, and if anything, again, these are things that should work in tandem with each other, right? Because insofar as, for instance, we have social ownership, well, that social ownership can grow and innovate easier if we have an optimal tax code and regulatory system, and it's like these things kind of support each other ultimately. And so those are two things with center left people that I think I try to point out is like, look, you're arguing for a perfect system that's never been achieved and governments clearly can't do it totally optimally. I'm arguing for an ideal system, and I recognize there's going to be trade-offs, but I don't think that like I think that we're ultimately just arguing about like what are the best ideal things to advocate for. And I think social ownership is definitely something, as an ideal worth advocating for if we can do it right. And insofar as you're saying we should have an optimal tax, regulatory, fiscal system, like, well, I can just like straight up agree with that.
Yeah. I was watching your video you did. It was like a clip from your stream where you were talking about taxation and leftism. And I thought it was really interesting, and that it's one of those things where it's like you mentioned some things where I'm like, I might disagree partially, but it doesn't matter because we both had the same thing of like, yeah, leftists should do better with their taxation points.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was a series. I wrote a series, The Left Needs Better Tax Policy, and that was kind of the crux of this series was like, hey guys, like, on the left, it feels like we advocate for suboptimal tax policy a lot, and it kind of, ends up making us sound a little bit more scary than I think we should. Like when AOC, she says something like, oh, the tax rate should be 70%. It's like, dude, that just sounds really scary to most people.
It does.
Right?
And then like
you have to have a way of framing it and like an actually better policy.
Yeah, that's one thing is like, yeah, that's great. Having like the top tax brackets be higher is good. Like that's not a wrong thing to do, but I think it's looking in the wrong place. It's still assuming that income tax is a good thing. When I think there's better ways of getting that money. I think income tax is kind of not the best way of doing it. And especially with things like sales tax. Sales tax is just ridiculous, but Anyway.
Yeah.
I don't know how much time you have, Econoboi, but I figured I probably have to get off around like 9-ish, so like 15 minutes or so.
Sure.
But I did want to ask you a little bit about your. So you said the Three Wonks podcast. That's dead now. There's no more Three Wonks.
No. We had some changes. Micah, he's going to law school, and I think SDL had some. I don't know. He was like busy with stuff as well, and I was busy with work, so we couldn't make the schedule work. But we've got a decent catalog for anyone that wants to go check them all out.
Oh, I thought it was maybe just because the concept was like a neo-lib, a socialist, and a social democrat, and then one of the social democrat became a socialist. So I thought maybe, Micah was just like, this isn't fair. I'm out of here.
Yeah, I guess the timing kind of worked out as well for my political transformation, but no, it just the scheduling became a little bit difficult, but the catalog is still out there if anyone wants to go watch it.
I would recommend people check it out. It's interesting. But I wanted to ask you about your other show, Lib and Learn, right? Mm-hmm. And you guys sure. It's like once a week you guys do the show, right?
That's right, yeah. Every Monday evenings.
So I wanted to ask you about it because I found it interesting. I mean, again, that, you joined another podcast where you're kind of like branded as the Lib, and then shortly thereafter you're like, actually, I don't know about that anymore. But I guess when I remember hearing about your show, I expected it to be like, I don't know, four guys with like David Pakman style politics. You know what I mean? Like kind of like soft social democrat, like Bernie-ish, maybe some of your co-hosts less so. But like I was surprised when I was watching it, like, it seems like you guys disagree about a lot more than I expected, which is like good. It makes the show interesting. But I was wondering, like, from your perspective, having now shifted from like kind of just considering yourself like a social democrat or like liberal type, now being like a socialist, do you find yourself like looking to kind of like mainstream democratic politics with like increasing frustration now, being like, okay, I have a pretty good idea that like better things are possible, and it feels like that's not really being reflected in the party?
I mean, I guess not really. Like, I think, yes and no. Like, I've always had, I guess the question is, like, do I have more frustration? Like, not that much more, because, I was always, the first presidential ballot I cast was for Bernie Sanders in the primary. I was a fan of him in 2016, fan of him in 2020. I think for a time I was more in favor of Warren because I felt like she had a better grasp of policy than Bernie did, but I still ended up strategically voting for him because there was no way that Warren was going to win my state. So I figured, well, Bernie's definitely the best option. And I think especially in hindsight, that especially was just like, that was just the better votes. Like in hindsight, I think I would have just voted for Bernie in the first place, like without any hesitation. But that's to say that, I've been on like the left end of the Democratic Party for my whole adult life. And so I've kind of always figured like, oh man, the Democrats they really should do so much more than what they're doing. I do understand that, look, I mean, insofar as I'm frustrated, it's just because I'm a minority. Most Democrats just are more moderate people, right? And so, we have a two-party system. It's coalition politics. You have to make compromises like this. If we lived in like a Dutch-style proportional system, I'd probably be in like the Socialist Left Party or like the Social Democratic Party or something like that, or the Labor Party, like whatever like the left-wing party would be, and then the moderates would be in their own party. But that's just not what we have. So, I've definitely been frustrated with them, but you can only do so much because they're getting pulled in so many different directions. I think that the best that, like for me personally, like I think that the best that I could do is for certain things. I think there's a surprisingly cross-ideological appeal. I think again, it's very aesthetic focused because, like for instance, like Trump signed an executive order to look into starting a sovereign wealth fund, right? And I don't know, and again, I don't know why this is. Like for some reason, I guess it's just like literally, it's just like such a mundane approach to socialism. Like, hey guys, sovereign wealth funds, look at that. All these other countries have them. That a lot of conservatives yeah, like a lot of conservatives are just like, God damn, it does make sense that all of us should have a say in, or that all of us should have a share in the economy. And
America
it's like,
first, baby.
Fuck. Yeah, it's like if you don't,
yeah, it's like talking about how he was saying like the only people that are America first are the socialists right now.
Andrew Schultz
being like, yeah, you're right. I was like, what the fuck is happening?
Yeah. So there's just like even Trump was saying we should do a sovereign wealth fund. I think a lot of the public wealth management stuff is very cross ideological. Like, I think if I went into a Chamber of Commerce meeting and said, one of the problems with government is that they inefficiently run all their assets. So here's what we should do: we should account for all the assets, put them into a holding corporation, and then we should hire experienced professionals to manage those assets for profit. It's like, bro, they would love that proposal. Like, that shit would get a fucking standing ovation at your average Chamber of Commerce meeting. Now, I am describing basically socialization of wealth, but I think that just goes to show that people's basic intuition is not actually against public ownership or socialization of wealth. It's like against like socialism and like the aesthetic and like the history of socialism. And so that's I guess an advantage and a disadvantage, where like some socialists will say it's not really socialist or it's not revolutionary in nature, but the advantage is that by taking what turns out to be such a mundane approach to socialism, you can kind of just like get people to end up agreeing with it, like, even though it's socialism. So it's kind of a funny thing, I guess.
So I guess I'm wondering, like, from your perspective, like how do you see, or I guess your idealized version of like pulling the party or the voters to kind of your version of things? Because I was just watching the Hutch, like one of Econoboi's co-hosts, posted a video on his channel. It was like, my co-host betrayed me, which was, I think, like tongue-in-cheek, but he was like yelling at all of you guys. I watched your section specifically where he was mad at you because you said that the Democratic Party should actually expect party members, like members of Congress, to actually adhere to certain standards. Like, for example, if you're going to be a senator, you have to believe in getting rid of the filibuster, because we literally can't pass legislation without you being in favor of it. So if you're not, you got to go, or we're going to try to get rid of you, basically. Like, we're going to try to primary you. Or if you're not pro-choice, you're not in favor of bringing back like LGBTQ rights, like all this, like there's a minimum standard. Like,
what else is the primary for?
Well, what else is a party for, right? Yeah. Other than having some sort of ideological.
If there's not like an ideological thing you all stand for. Like, and
well, that's the thing. Like, you guys, I mean, I guess you guys are Canadian, so you would like. This is like the American mind. It has a hard time comprehending this. Where like, in parliamentary systems, it is totally normal for there to be a strict party line. On just certain things, and if you are not in favor of that party line, you literally will get kicked out of the party. And it's not just that. Oh, you won't be invited to parties and you'll get shunned and people will talk shit about you. You will not be able to run as that party anymore.
You're an independent now.
Kicked out.
And when you lose that party association, it's usually the end of your political career. There has been, like, recently there was someone in the Liberal Party who got removed from the Liberal Party. She somehow won her seat again. And that was only because it was like a huge controversy removing her.
Oh,
Ray, I can't remember her name.
And so, like, that's true. And then also when it comes like coalition agreements, it's the exact same thing, that if you do enter into a coalition agreement or a confidence supply agreement, that if you step outside of that agreement, the whole fucking government will get blown up, and you'll either have to renegotiate a coalition with another partner, or you'll have new elections, right? Just be like, oh, well, fuck, we don't agree with how to run the government anymore. We have to have new elections. And so obviously in America, we don't have a parliamentary system. And so we don't have as much kind of central control over party messaging and ideology, which does suck, and we should have those things. But it's like, I'm just saying, I think on a bare minimum standard, there are just certain things where I get it. It's a big tent of people that are in the Democratic Party. I'm not representative. I'm very far to the left of the median Democrat. But I think on certain like extremely basic things, the Democrats should have a really strict standard on. Like, I think the filibuster, the reason I mentioned that as an example, like you guys said, it's like, if you're a Democrat that says, I believe in the filibuster, what you're saying is, I just don't think the Democratic platform is like worth a shit. Like, who actually gives a fuck about immigration reform? Who actually gives a fuck about protecting abortion rights? Who actually gives a fuck about protecting gay rights, trans rights? Who actually gives a fuck about like any actual big structural spending reform, raising the minimum wage, passing unionization reform? Yeah, like, who gives a shit about fucking like anything besides just some changes around the edges on some of our fiscal packages? Like, that's what you're saying when you're in favor of the filibuster. And so, to Hutch's point, he says, well, look, you might have a guy in Missouri who feels like he needs to be in favor of the filibuster and he's like the only Democrat that can win in Missouri. It's like, okay, well, number one, he's just wrong about that. It's not clear to me that people in Missouri or West Virginia or whatever give that much of a fuck about the filibuster as an institution. And then two, it's like, even if that's true, I think that there's like a long-term advantage of just having a minimum standard and saying, look, when we take power, we're going to get rid of this institution. Because that's another thing in parliamentary systems that you guys are aware. I guess it's different when you have a minority government, but insofar as you can enter into a coalition agreement or achieve a majority government in a parliamentary system, it's very credible that the government will be able to actually do what they ran on.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's just a majority vote at that point, and guess who has a majority? The government does.
Yeah.
Right?
We have some, like...
They can do it.
We have some weird things, like constitutional and charter amendments are both difficult to do because you have to open up a referendum, and that's where our system falls apart, because referendums are absolute dog shit. But yeah, on a whole, it's a little easier up here to get anything done.
Yeah, and at the very least, like I'm sure there's a lot of instances in parliamentary systems where governments take office and they don't do what's on their platform.
Oh, absolutely.
But then, if that happens, like if America got rid of the filibuster, and let's say the Democrats control Congress and they control the House and they control the presidency, then if Democrats don't do what they say they're going to do, you can't use that as an excuse. Hey, dude, there is no filibuster anymore. You could just vote for the things that you proposed, right? You could propose the things you proposed. And in a parliamentary system, like I think that's where I think it's more sensible, I think, to blame a government when they don't do what's on their platform, because it's like, bro, you could just do it. You ran on it. You have this strict party line. You guys have a majority in government, or the coalition agreed to it. Why the fuck aren't you guys doing it? Like, you could just do the vote, right? And so that's, to me, a much more democratic system. And
if you ask our Liberal Party, it's the leftists' fault that we don't have electoral reform, despite them having a majority of government and fully being able to do it.
That was so cool.
Yeah, and that's ridiculous. Yeah, like, you got people, like with Justin Trudeau, when people called him out for that, it's very sensible, because it's clearly like, you guys were in favor of election reform when you had like 20 seats in the parliament, but now that you're a majority party again, it's like, well, actually, it turns out we don't need that. And it's like, no.
Yeah.
You don't need that, because you're in the majority right now, but the country at large probably
if we pass this electoral reform, we won't get a majority ever again.
What a shame.
Right. We'll be stuck at,
fair
oh
elections.
My goodness, yeah, we'll have, well, the 35% of the vote we got will only get us 35% of the control. It's like, well, that's,
yeah.
Gosh darn democracy. What are you going to do about it? Like, I don't know, man. So anyway.
All right. Well, we're coming
up.
Good
talking to you guys. You guys got to go.
Here. Yeah. Thanks so much for talking with us. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, man.
For sure. Yeah, no, this was unexpected, and it was a really fun conversation. And if you guys ever want to talk again, obviously just reach out. It was really fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'd love to have you on again sometime. Maybe we'll get you on our podcast at some point whenever we get that more regular.
Someday.
For sure. All right. Talk to you guys later.
Thanks a lot, man.
See
Have
you
a good
later,
one.
All right, I've ended our broadcast, so I'm going to sign off properly here. There we go. Okay. He's done.
We're good?
Yep.
We're off?
We're good.